We often look to the past to understand ourselves. Tonight, we turn our attention to the year 1888 and the solemn story of Annie Chapman. It's a case that reminds us that behind historical records are real people, whose lives were irrevocably changed by the events that transpired. This is their story, as best as it can be told. The autumn of 1888 found London's East End steeped in a mixture of fog, coal smoke, and palpable fear. The district of Whitechapel was an abyss of poverty, a maze of gaslit alleys and overcrowded tenements where thousands lived on the brink of destitution. For many women, survival was a daily struggle, dependent on precarious, low-wage work or the nightly trade of selling themselves for the few pence needed for a bed in a common lodging house. In late August, the murder of Marianne Nichols had sent a ripple of unease through these streets. But it was the event that followed just 1 week later that would turn that unease into outright terror, cementing the dreadful reality that a new kind of predator was stalking the city's most vulnerable. Annie Chapman was not born into the poverty that would ultimately define the end of her life. Born Eliza Ann Smith in 1840, she came from a respectable working-class family. Her father was a soldier, and she grew up in London and Windsor. By all accounts, it was a legitimate marriage, and for over a decade, Annie lived a life of relative stability and middle-class comfort. She and John had 3 children, Emily Ruth, Annie Georgina, and John Alfred. They had a home, an income, and a place in society. Photographs from this period show a handsome woman, well-dressed and looking directly at the camera with a confident gaze. She was known to be intelligent and industrious. This was the woman her friends and family knew, not the destitute figure she would later become, but a wife and a mother whose life held the promise of a quiet, ordinary future. The descent from that ordinary life was gradual, then catastrophic. It was a path marked by personal tragedy and the unforgiving nature of Victorian society. The first devastating blow came with the death of their eldest daughter, 12-year-old Emily Ruth, from meningitis. Both Annie and her husband were deeply affected, and both began to drink heavily in the years that followed. Another child, John, was born with disabilities and required institutional care. These pressures strained the marriage to its breaking point. By the early 1880s, Annie and John had separated. John, as was legally customary, agreed to pay his wife a maintenance allowance of 10 shillings a week. This small sum was Annie's lifeline. But when John Chapman died from alcohol-related liver disease in 1886, that lifeline was severed. With no income and her ties to a stable life now broken, Annie Chapman's decline accelerated. She drifted into the heart of the East End, moving between the district's grim lodging houses, her existence funded by crochet work, selling flowers, and, when all else failed, casual prostitution. In early September of 1888, Annie Chapman was living at Crossingham's lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, a notorious and squalid thoroughfare in Spitalfields. At 47, she was in poor health, suffering from a lung condition, likely tuberculosis. Her friends knew her as Dark Annie on account of her dark brown hair. Her final days were marked by desperation. On the evening of September 6th, 2 days before her death, she had a physical altercation with a fellow lodger, Eliza Cooper, reportedly over a rival's claim on a bar of soap. The fight left Annie with a bruised eye and chest. By Friday, September 7th, she was visibly unwell and out of money. The lodging house deputy, Timothy Donovan, saw her several times that day. She felt too ill to do any work. That evening, Donovan told her she would have to pay her 4 pence for a bed or leave. Around 1:45 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, September 8th, Annie returned to the lodging house. She was still without the money for her bed. She gave Donovan her last 2 pence for a cup of tea and some bread, telling another resident, "I haven't sufficient money for my lodgings. I must go and find some." She walked out of the lodging house and into the pre-dawn darkness of the Whitechapel streets. Hanbury Street was a long, narrow road that cut through the heart of Spitalfields. Number 29 was a 3-story brick tenement building home to 17 people. A dark, covered passageway ran from the street to a backyard, a small enclosed space containing a wooden fence, a shed, and a water tap. At approximately 6 a.m. on the morning of September 8th, one of the residents, a market porter named John Davis, walked down this passageway to use the outhouse in the yard. As he stepped out from the passage, he made a horrific discovery. Lying on the ground near the steps leading to the back door was the body of a woman. Her head was angled towards the house, and her clothes were disarranged. Davis, stunned and terrified, did not approach. He ran from the property to find 2 other men working nearby, and together they immediately went to fetch the police. The early morning quiet of Hanbury Street was about to be shattered by the arrival of constables, detectives, and the local surgeon, and with them the realization that the killer who had struck in Bucks Row a week earlier had returned. The scene that confronted the police and the divisional police surgeon, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, was one of chilling, methodical violence. Annie Chapman lay on her back between the stone steps and the fence. Dr. Phillips's initial examination revealed that her throat had been severed with 2 deep cuts. Upon further inspection at the mortuary, the full horrific nature of her injuries became clear. The attack had been one of extreme and savage mutilation. The coroner's report detailed how the killer had inflicted terrible abdominal injuries, removing certain internal organs with a degree of anatomical knowledge that seemed to suggest professional skill, perhaps that of a surgeon or a butcher. Unlike the previous victim, Annie's personal possessions were found arranged neatly near her feet. They included a piece of an envelope, a small comb, and a piece of coarse muslin. Curiously, 2 brass rings that she was known to always wear, one a wedding ring, were missing. They had not been dropped, but evidently removed from her fingers, which were swollen, suggesting it had taken some force to do so. The killer had taken a trophy. News of the second murder spread like wildfire, and the press fanned the flames of public panic. The 2 killings were so similar in their ferocity and location that the city was forced to accept a terrifying new reality. A serial murderer was at work. In the absence of a suspect, fear created its own monster. Local gossip and prejudice coalesced around a phantom-like figure known as Leather Apron, a local Jewish man rumored to extort money from women in the area, 14. The description was vague and fueled by anti-Semitic sentiment, but it was enough for police to launch a manhunt. They arrested a Polish Jewish shoemaker named John Pizer, who was known to wear a leather apron for his trade. Pizer had a prior conviction for a stabbing offense, but he had solid alibis for both murders. 15. He was eventually released, an innocent man caught in the dragnet of public hysteria. The leather apron scare demonstrated how a terrified community, in its desperation for answers, could turn on itself. Meanwhile, the true killer remained a ghost, his identity as elusive as his motives. The official inquest into Annie Chapman's death was held at the Working Lads Institute in Whitechapel and presided over by Coroner Wynne Edwin Baxter. For days, the court heard testimony from those who had known Annie, piecing together the final, tragic chapter of her life. Her friend, Amelia Palmer, tearfully identified the body. Timothy Donovan, the lodging house deputy, recounted her last known words. Eliza Cooper testified about their fight, revealing the small, desperate conflicts that defined life on the margins. The most crucial testimony came from Dr. Phillips. He stated his firm belief that the instrument used was a long, thin, very sharp knife, at least 6 to 8 inches in length. He famously opined that the killer's removal of specific organs displayed a level of anatomical knowledge. I am of the opinion that the person who did it would have some knowledge of the kind, he stated, adding, he must have had a good deal of knowledge to have removed the pelvic organs with one sweep of the knife. This expert opinion solidified the terrifying image of a calculating, skilled killer, not just a madman, but a monster with a purpose. The murder of Annie Chapman was a pivotal moment in the 1888 Reign of Terror. 16, coming just 8 days after the death of Mary Ann Nichols, it established a clear and horrifying pattern. Both women were middle-aged, impoverished, and killed in the early morning hours in a secluded but publicly accessible space. Both had their throats cut, and both suffered extreme abdominal mutilation. This murder removed any doubt that the attacks were connected. The press began referring to the events as the Whitechapel murders, and the police were now certain they were hunting a single, extraordinarily dangerous individual. The city was gripped by fear. Vigilance committees were formed by concerned East End business owners who patrolled the streets at night. The police commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, ordered an increase in police presence, but the dark, winding, and unlit streets of Whitechapel were nearly impossible to secure. It was in the weeks following Annie's death that the killer would, for the first time, give himself a name. A letter, claiming to be from the murderer and signed Jack the Ripper, would soon arrive at the Central News Agency, forever branding the unknown assailant with his infamous and immortal moniker. Despite a massive police investigation, hundreds of interviews, and the detention of numerous suspects, the killer of Annie Chapman was never brought to justice. Her murder, like the others attributed to Jack the Ripper, remains officially unsolved. The rings that were stolen from her were never recovered. In the end, Annie Chapman is remembered primarily as the second canonical victim of a legendary killer. But to see her only as that is to miss the profound tragedy of her individual life. She was a daughter, a wife, and a mother who experienced comfort and stability before falling victim to personal grief, addiction, and a society that had few safety nets for a woman in her position. Her story, and the story of the other women killed in that terrifying autumn, serves as a stark reminder of the humanity so often erased by the shadow of a notorious crime. They were not just victims, they were women who lived, struggled, and deserved more than their violent and anonymous end. Thank you for spending this time with us. Reflecting on these past events is a way of remembering the individuals involved and the impact their stories had on their communities. If you have any thoughts on today's case, we invite you to share them respectfully in the comments below. We hope you will join us again for our next true crime case.